Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. For those of y'all who are joining us here in the auditorium, we just ask that you please silence your cell phones. And those of y'all on Zoom, please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. As always, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. Now, if you didn't see at the front desk, we have our new September through December program calendars out. So be sure to grab your copy on your way out. We have a lot of great programming planned throughout the rest of the year. A full slate of History for Lunch presentations. The next one is scheduled for Wednesday, September 3rd. Local historians Bill and Chris Barber will explore how Terrill County's hero of the American Revolution, Colonel Edward Buncombe, became American by choice, so focusing on the final 10 years of his remarkable life. So we hope that y'all will join us for that on September the 3rd. Now, today we welcome public historian Perri Meldon, who will explore what became of the Great Dismal Swamp after 1865, focusing on decisions made by Black, white, and Native farmers, landowners, hunters, and lumbermen who shaped the vitality of this wetland. So please join us in welcoming Ms. Meldon to the stage. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's really nice to see so many faces at a noontime talk. I'm joining you all from Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, so I drove out this morning and I'm really glad to land in Elizabeth City. I am going to set a timer also so I keep track of myself. I'll be talking for about half an hour or so before we open up for Q&A. First, I just want to express my thanks to Lori, to Noah, to everyone here at Museum of the Albemarle, and again, to all of you for being here in person and those joining us online. As mentioned, my name is Perri Meldon. I am completing my PhD in American Studies at Boston University, which I'll be finishing this fall. I live, as mentioned, in Virginia, so though I'm doing my work in Boston, I live in Virginia, and much of my family is in the Hampton Roads area. I came to this work because my family has run a multi-generational business on the Northwest River, and I would come and visit them, and none of them ever went into the swamp. But I was so curious about this mess on the map, and why would they never go to the place where their business backed up to? So that led into my inquiry of learning about this place. And I look forward to sharing some of those findings with you today. So I'd like to begin by orienting us to the swamp, though I imagine if you're here today, it might mean that you're local, and so you probably already know the swamp pretty intimately. That is also a reason I love doing these kind of talks, because I love to hear from participants in the audience of their own experiences and knowledge of this place. I will also fully acknowledge that much of my work has been focused more on Virginia, so I welcome your expertise here in North Carolina, though I think in many ways the Great Dismal Swamp is special because it transcends these state boundaries. So as you can see from this slide, the swamp is just northwest of here and extends into Virginia. 9,000 years ago, the swamp stretched 1 million acres. Since the 17th century, Euro-Americans, Native peoples, and African Americans have engaged with, shaped, and responded to this evolving swamp ecosystem. We experience the swamp today as a national wildlife refuge and a state park. The wildlife refuge was designated in 1974. It began with 49,000 acres gifted by a paper products company. Some of you or your family members may have even worked with Union Camp, the company that donated this land. Since the 1970s, the wildlife refuge has since expanded to 113,000 acres. And what we now experience as the state park was originally a natural heritage area, of which it was redesignated as a state park in the early 2000s. So you may have heard of the Great Dismal Swamp as a site of marronage, defined as the temporary and permanent resettlement of enslaved people who fled and found refuge in hard-to-reach places. It is believed that prior to the Civil War, possibly thousands of self-emancipated, enslaved African American men, women, and children migrated through and established settlements upon the swamp's higher ground. That is not the topic of my presentation today, though I'm happy to speak later to the ecological impacts of marronage and the enduring communities here who are working to commemorate their histories. Instead, I will be focusing more on the years after 1865. Since I began my research 6 years ago, one question has nagged at me. How is it that we still have a Great Dismal Swamp today, when so many wetlands in the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast have been drained? Why is the Great Dismal Swamp still so immense? In my presentation, I'll talk about some of the reasons that I believe the swamp is still here today. I'll frame my findings by highlighting the different ways that people have perceived of the swamp, especially after 1865. How have people interacted with it? And how has the swamp acted or responded to these different perceptions we have of it? In asking these questions, I'll show how the swamp has meant many things to many different people, which is what makes this wetland such a complex and intriguing place. While I have visited archives, museums, historical societies, and libraries, I've also considered the landscape itself as part of my archive. By that, I mean there are many historic markers, be it signage, a ditch, or canal locks, that help to tell the story of how the swamp has evolved over the past 400 years. Here is one such example of places I consider my archive. You see here the Dismal Swamp Canal, which was constructed in the early 19th century, spanning 22 miles between Deep Creek, Virginia, and South Mills, North Carolina. The waterway that flows into the distance and trail it off into the horizon is the feeder canal that connects with Lake Drummond within the swamp towards the west. Before I go any further in the presentation, I want to ensure that I highlight the people whose research and advocacy I'm indebted to. The swamp for many has been a site of refuge. Since they were forcibly removed in the 1640s from their ancestral lands near the Nansemond River in present-day Virginia, some members of the Nansemond Indian Nation have called the northern parts of the Great Dismal Swamp home. The swamp sheltered Nansemond people from the expansion of settler colonialism over the 18th century, and tribal members continue to live near the swamp today. Prior to the Civil War, the swamp also served as refuge for African Americans who opted for the peril of hiding in the swamp over the violence of enslavement. Many scholars, as well as descendant communities, have worked to bring light to these stories of Black and Native placemaking. Some of these scholars include Daniel Sayers, Marcus Nevius, Catherine Benjamin Golden, and Brett Morris. I also would encourage you to check out the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholders Collaborative, which is a group of Black and Native descendants and their allies and supporters of the Great Dismal Swamp at large in advocating for cultural and ecological heritage here. I would love to be able to tell you more about them, and I know that they're always welcoming new members to join their collaborative. Any one of us can become a part of it. As long as the swamp served as a site of refuge prior to the Civil War, it also served as a site of lumber extraction, an industry that persisted well into the 20th century. Lumber companies like Camp Manufacturing, later Union Camp, Roper, Richmond Cedar Works, and Wallace & Co. are just some of the entrepreneurs that capitalized on this swamp forest. The Great Dismal Swamp is rich with juniper, the regional name for Atlantic white cedar. Juniper today is an ecologically rare species found in pockets along the eastern seaboard from Maine to Mississippi. Once harvested, juniper is extremely hard to reestablish. On this slide, you see what remains of Jericho Ditch, dredged by enslaved laborers and free people of color in the early 19th century. This ditch is just outside of the city of Suffolk in Virginia. While many of the workers' names go unrecorded in the archive, I'd like to highlight Willis A. Hodges, a free person of color from Princess Anne County or present-day Virginia Beach. In the first decades of the 19th century, Hodges worked on the Dismal Swamp Canal before leaving for New York, where he became active in the abolition movement. He eventually returned to Virginia, where he was a prominent anti-slavery activist. Next to, and here's where I'll use the little clicker, next to Jericho Ditch, there's a gravel road. You can see it over there in the corner on what was a former towpath. This is one of over 150 miles of ditches that carve the swamp landscape, as well as one of the only ways to enter the wildlife refuge today. Ditches like this one were used to haul lumber, while other ditches may have been used to drain the land for agriculture and to easier access to timber harvests. Ditching continued after the Civil War, and as the ditches and roadways penetrated the swamp ecosystem, the infrastructure would forever change the wetland. For instance, this is a far drier swamp, and if you've been into the swamp, you might be surprised by just how dry it is, and it's largely a result of these 150 miles of ditches. Bringing us into the 20th century, the swamp's meaning began to change for the people of this region. Some of you may be familiar with the Jamestown Exposition that was held in 1907. It was in this year that Virginians marked 300 years since the English established the first permanent English colony in what would become the US. Local, state, and federal governments planned a year-long celebration to be hosted at different venues throughout the region. And as this 1906 article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch describes, visitors seeking colonial-era landmarks could visit Jamestown, Yorktown, the Norfolk Naval Yard, or the Great Dismal Swamp. I've seen multiple advertisements for the Jamestown Exposition that shows the Dismal Swamp as a tourist attraction. I can't see you all too well, but I will pause to ask how many of you all have been to Colonial Williamsburg? Okay, and how many of you have been into the Great Dismal Swamp? All right, there's a good overlap there. How many of you would say they're pretty equal in tourist quality? Yeah, that's also how I feel. Well, we like to think of the 1960s and 1970s as an era when people began to protect the Great Dismal Swamp, but as I have found, the swamp has really been treated as an artifact of some earlier time in American history since the early 20th century. There were repeated calls from civic organizations, local and state officials, and even inquiries from the federal government about whether the Great Dismal Swamp might be worth conserving as a national park, national forest, national preserve. It's in part because of events like the Jamestown Exposition in the early 20th century that the swamp became embedded in public memory as a vestige of the colonial era. It was considered a primeval place where people could visit and imagine how William Byrd or George Washington may have seen it in the 18th century. So here we see an 1807 map of the swamp. Part of the reason that visitors like to imagine they could experience the wetland as colonists would have experienced it is that many of its built features remained embedded in the landscape. For example, William Byrd surveyed the North Carolina-Virginia border through the swamp in 1728. There is the borderline. And the Washington Ditch and Jericho ditches up here in the northwest quadrant were constructed during George Washington's time in the second half of the 18th century. The Dismal Swamp Canal, which at my angle I can't see so well, but I believe at my angle I think we're seeing it right here, was completed in the early 19th century. So for these Jamestown exposition organizers, they would portray trips along these ditches and canals as bucolic and reminiscent of pre-industrial times. To be clear, though, these visitors or these trips were intended for white visitors, and no mention was made that enslaved African Americans dug and maintained these waterways. But not all were swayed by this romanticized boosterism. At the same time that certain boosters expounded on the swamp's colonial heritage and others considered its potential as a national park or otherwise, some New South proponents argued that the Dismal Swamp was better off drained. Drainage advocates believed that the Great Dismal Swamp hampered the region's economic viability. For centuries, low-lying places like swamps were believed to carry miasmas, or bad air, which carried disease. This is one reason why poor and enslaved people were more likely to live in places like a swamp, where land was less desirable. By the early 20th century, people still harbored fears of wetlands and their capacity to breed disease. And in both Virginia and North Carolina, local and state officials claimed that the wetland held rich agricultural soil, if only it were drained. Congressman John Small of North Carolina was especially vocal on the matter of drainage, arguing that it was essential to lift this region into 20th century modernity after the Civil War. Today, there are swaths of farm and residential land across both North Carolina and Virginia that was at one point a swamp. It's not unrelated that this area is still pretty swampy today. It's not just that it's low-lying, it's that it was in fact part of this greater geological swamp. But there was no concerted effort in the long run to drain the Great Dismal Swamp, in part because the federal government never decided to invest in such a project. Okay, just checking my time. We're good. And I'll take a sip of water. So, hunting has long served as a subsistence activity, as well as source of recreation. We've talked about the swamp as a refuge, as logging woods, as imbued with colonial heritage, and as you saw in the previous slide, as a form of cancer. While some of these perceptions are bound to a specific point in time, one thing that the swamp has always been, both prior to and following colonial arrival, is a hunting ground. Since time immemorial, people have hunted here, including bear, bobcat, turkey, squirrel, deer. Here we see a photograph taken in 1895 of two men with a herring holding up a dead black bear. For lumbermen and farmers, including those who both sharecropped or owned the land, hunting for subsistence helped put food on the table and perhaps make a few dollars for selling pelts or meat at market. After the Civil War, the Dismal Swamp also drew attention as an exotic wilderness that beckoned northern sportsmen. Many wilds of the swamp and the opportunity for hunting game would lure people as described in sportsmen's journals of the late 19th century. But I do want to emphasize that hunting as a sport was an activity wrapped in race and class perceptions of the Jim Crow era. White sportsmen often derided Black and Native knowledge, though outsiders often hired Black and Native hunters as their guides into the swamp. Likewise, hunting for sport was often a wealthy man's activity from which poor whites, as well as Black and Native residents, were excluded. Up until the time that the swamp became a national wildlife refuge, hunting cabins dotted the edges of Lake Drummond. The logging companies permitted the workers, Black and white, to hunt in the swamp. It was never a big fishing spot, but these hunting cabins were beloved by individual families and hunt clubs alike. Some of you may have memories from having ever visited one. When the wildlife refuge was established in 1974, owners of these hunt clubs were required to vacate after a certain period of time. None of these structures remain within the swamp. If you go out onto Lake Drummond, it looks quote unquote untouched, but people have long been there. One of the reasons that the swamp is such a biologically diverse ecosystem is because of fire. The swamp has always been a fire-prone place, a place that benefits from burning. We're seeing here a detail from an aerial view of the 2011 fire that destroyed significant acreage of the swamp in just 1 month. The fire was likely caused by lightning. To give us a frame of reference, a 3,000-acre lake pools at the center of the Great Dismal Swamp, that is Lake Drummond. To the right or left or east or west, you can see forest with swampland, and just beyond that is farmland. The red and pink of burned land is then blurred by the blue of smoke. In short, fire is a natural process in the swamp, but ditching and deforestation have exacerbated the rate of wildfire. With over 150 miles of ditches, the swamp dries out and risks uncontrolled wildfire. When the swamp catches fire, the peat beneath it disintegrates and reconstitutes, which creates drier conditions for species like maple and pine to grow instead of the juniper and cypress that we so associate with the Great Dismal Swamp. In the early 20th century, lumber companies and foresters suppressed fires, believing they caused more harm to profitability and regrowth. That perspective has since evolved as conservationists now consider the swamp healthy when it strikes the correct balance of inundation and seasonal fire to foster the growth of juniper and other species. Through public-private partnerships, the refuge today, as well as the Dismal Swamp State Park, they both practice a delicate dance of fire and water management to restore an ecosystem transformed by ditching and forest harvests. In the 1980s, the Wildlife Refuge introduced prescribed fire. In so doing, they must strike this balance between restoring the swamp ecosystem and protecting the more urban areas around it. I imagine that if you've lived here long enough and the wind was heading southeast, you might have smelled dismal swamp smoke at some point. One thing is for certain in the first half of the 20th century, the swamp proved a headache for the logging companies that owned parcels of it. The swamp's fires were difficult to manage, while its ecology got in the way of lumber extraction. Logging companies found it did not prove economically viable to adapt their forestry practices to encourage juniper growth. By the 1940s and 1950s, dismal swamp-based lumber companies went out of business or set their sights further south. Since the turn of the 20th century, one lumber outfit owned that prized Washington tract, at one time owned by the Dismal Swamp Company, of which George Washington was a founding member and stockholder. This was Union Camp, first established as camp manufacturing in 1909. The Washington Tract was beloved by the Camp family, and throughout the 20th century, they often invited visitors to come see this historic acreage. Yet, between the loss of profit and the increased advocacy from locals to protect the swamp, Union Camp decided to gift the wetland to the federal government in the early 1970s. Following a feasibility study conducted by the Secretary of the Interior, the swamp became a national wildlife refuge in 1974 and the North Carolina stretch as a natural heritage area. I have found over 400 references in newspapers and journals across the US that announced George Washington's gift. Union Camp's decision to give up the swamp was framed as an early example of corporate social responsibility, as that gift occurred just 4 years after the first Earth Day celebration in 1970. It's also worth mentioning that Union Camp received a significant tax break at around $12 million for donating their Dismal Swamp tract to the federal government. So you can see here one such headline featured in 1973 in US News and World Report that industry steps in to save the land. You can also see the highlighted parcel, the original 49,000 acres, as well as this greater stretch down into North Carolina as a natural heritage area. This gift was frequently tied to George Washington, who is featured above here. Visiting Lake Drummond. Over the decades, the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge has focused on restoring this ecosystem from the harmful impacts of logging, ditching, and deforestation. Their primary tasks include managing the water that flows through the ditch networks, as well as encouraging habitat for varied species from the red cockaded woodpecker to juniper or Atlantic white cedar. While the 1970s congressional hearings emphasized stories of George Washington, absent from these conversations were stories of maroon communities, slave resistance, and Native peoples. Yet those stories were always there, told by descendant communities, some of whom still lived and continue to live on the edge of the swamp. In the early 2000s, these stories increasingly became public knowledge through the collaboration of descendants and archaeologist Daniel Sayers. Sayers, who conducted the archaeological research, uncovered tools like those of maroon communities and Native peoples, and this confirms what generational stories and 19th century news reports had long communicated, that temporary and permanent settlements of Black and Native peoples were common in the swamp prior to the Civil War. With this increased public attention on marronage in the swamp, a group of descendant communities and allies joined together to call upon Virginia and North Carolina representatives. In 2020 and again in 2021, Representative Donald McEachin of Virginia introduced the Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Act. Congress passed this act, which initiated a 3-year study to assess the feasibility of whether the Dismal Swamp region is a place where historic, cultural, and natural resources combine to form a cohesive, nationally important landscape. If the Great Dismal Swamp becomes a national heritage area, partnerships between the National Park Service and private organizations will enhance cultural heritage and tourism opportunities. The study is ongoing, and there are opportunities for public participation. I know that Museum of the Albemarle participated last year in inviting some of the National Park Service planners, of which I was honored to tag along, and we enjoyed a day in Elizabeth City, learning about its significance in the Dismal Swamp's history. At the local level, communities that surround the swamp are already amplifying the histories of Black and Native placemaking. In addition to places like Museum of the Albemarle, Dismal Swamp State Park, and the Wildlife Refuge, there are also two locally driven examples I've shared here. In the upper left, we see the Cornland School Museum and Historical Village in Chesapeake, which opened to the public just last summer 2024. The Cornland School was first established shortly after emancipation for formerly enslaved people. The schoolhouse that stands today was built in 1902 and operated until 1952. Reopened today as a museum, descendant communities of that school, as well as the city of Chesapeake, have worked to renovate the building and help interpret the histories of Black life and education along the Dismal Swamp Canal. In the bottom right, we see the interpretive pavilion being constructed near Jericho Ditch. In creating this pavilion, the city of Suffolk, Virginia, is partnering with their public schools to interpret local histories in place. Visitors will be able to learn about the enslaved laborers who constructed the ditch and the economic roles it played in supporting the logging industry. It also will help to shed light on maroon communities and the enduring presence of the Nansemond Indian Nation who live just northerly of this ditch. As a wrap-up, I'd like to offer a few more opportunities to interact with the swamp, this time from the comforts of your computer. The way that I got tapped into learning about Museum of the Albemarle was that I had given a presentation earlier this year to the Great Bridge Museum in Chesapeake. This was building off of a fellowship that I held through Virginia Humanities. And during that time in that fellowship, I knew that I wanted to create an online feature that would invite people to access the swamp. This was important to me because the swamp is physically quite hard to access. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, though my family might work right at the edge of it, no one has ever gone in and no one wants to go in. So here are ways to show why the swamp matters. So access to the swamp is limited to boardwalks, gravel roads, and paddling. So my work with Virginia Humanities aimed to orient visitors to the swamp's unique environs, capturing its stories through written word, audio clips, and mapping. So I encourage you to check out this feature, which is available through Encyclopedia Virginia. This resource provides an overview of the swamp's cultural and environmental histories from the pre-colonial era to the present. My favorite aspect of this project, though, was the virtual tour that I developed with the director of Encyclopedia Virginia, Peter Headland. In fall 2023, Peter and I traveled to different locations in the swamp to offer a 360 view with Google Maps. So you can now travel to places like Washington Ditch, Lake Drummond, the Cornland School, and elsewhere. So this is just a little still, but you can see there's the arrows there, so you could actually be on level ground with the swamp and go in without getting your feet wet. So I hope this might serve as a resource, and I would love to see ways in which this could be expanded to include more sites, the North Carolina regions where the Dismal Swamp still makes its presence known. And lastly, I'd like to conclude with this final point. As I've shown in my presentation, the swamp has meant many things to many people. It's because the swamp captures our imagination, because people care for it, and because the swamp has seemingly refused to comply with humans' plans to destroy it, that we can continue to cherish this place. And so I'll end by highlighting just a couple of other ways you can virtually interact with the swamp. You can listen to Chief Emeritus Sam Bass of the Nansemond Indian Nation on the podcast Tribal Truths. Chief Emeritus Bass shares stories of Nansemond placemaking, especially through hunting and recreation in this audio feature. You can also check out the story map, The Great Dismal Swamp, a safe haven for centuries, built by that group that I mentioned earlier, the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholders Collaborative. So both offer points of access, again, if you don't feel like exposing yourself to mosquitoes or mud. And that wraps it up. Thank you so much.
What the status is for the superintendent down for the city of Chesapeake. They were held up because of other things wanting to live in the hive that stopped. They got a grant to work on it. Do you know where the status is of that right now?
Thank you for that question, and I'm also happy to repeat it if that's helpful for Zoom. So the question was about the status of the superintendent's house on the Dismal Swamp Canal, which was due for historic preservation but was halted. The last I heard in my communications with the city of Chesapeake, which was late winter, early spring of this year, it was still held up, and that's because there is a maternal colony of bats that are living. Yep.
Something else to encourage the bats to go live over there and get out of the superintendent's hive.
They were.
Bats are pretty smart, but that was holding up the renovation of the superintendent's hive. And I haven't talked to Chesapeake lately either, but I wondered if the bats didn't decide to go somewhere else.
We're gonna have to find out, because yes, I'll just repeat again for those who are joining online. The city of Chesapeake was working with the state because this is a threatened species that they needed to transfer this colony of bats, but they were just trying to gently encourage it to live elsewhere. We both need to find out what the latest status is on that. But I think it's also, you know, I love that story. I remember when learning about this, oh gosh, I think it's just so telling because it reminds us for whom, it reminds us to ask for whom the swamp is, like who belongs in the swamp, including all the species.
There's so much history
Mm-hmm.
in the superintendent's hive that we need to bring out.
Yeah.
That the bats are holding it.
It's also theirs.
Active. I've come across a video on YouTube of group of folks trying to I don't know about recreating, but finding spots that may have been like habitated by the Maroonists or runaway slaves, and they were. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know if they're just rebuilding huts or whatever. Are they anything active going on like that now?
So the question was, what sort of work is being done to interpret in place the histories of marine communities, including telling those stories or even potentially rebuilding? The actual archaeological sites where that work has been done is kept confidential, and it's also largely inaccessible for all of us. So in many cases, if you're looking at state or federal archaeological reports, you'll see there's that sort of sensitive information will often be redacted to protect sensitive archaeological information about any community, particularly historically vulnerable communities. You may have seen there are a series of videos where present day actors are interpreting history's first person of enslaved people, maroon communities through their diaries. For instance, the diary, the slave narrative of Moses Grandy, who purchased his own freedom, had worked on the Dismal Swamp Canal. And those are all being done by this group, the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholders Collaborative. So that's one way in, and that's probably primarily the leading group doing a lot of this more descendant focused or ancestor focused work. And if this National Heritage Area passes, they're nearing the end of year 2 in their work of out of 3. We would hope that we could invest in more projects like that. Yeah, thanks for the question.
There will be a ceremony, whatever the first Saturday in September is, at Camden Courthouse at 10 o'clock in recognition and putting a, monument or stone up for Moses Grandin.
Okay, yeah, just again repeating, there will be a stone installed and a memorial ceremony in honor of Moses Grandy in September at the Camden County Courthouse.
Starts at 10 o'clock and they're going to show you where this stone is being made permanent.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you, Perri, for traveling to the coast or to Pasco County with a potential hurricane. Well, if there is a hurricane out on the coast. But thank you for coming, and thank you all for coming today. We greatly appreciate your visitation and your participation in our programs. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you.